Bretonnia, strong cavalry, fast and chivalrous, supported by willingful peasants and squires, the finest knights at your disposal. In this video I'll show you every unit from the Bretonnia roster and include their stats before and after research XP Redline skills. I'll also go over the lords and their specific abilities and skills that they gain. So just to show what I typically showcase in these army rosters, here are all the stats, in this case of the foot squires, before and after the redline skills, research buffs and XP. This is to better showcase how the unit becomes later on in the game, to give you a better idea of what it can accomplish. Okay, this is in essence just something that I've added so that you can have a better grasp on your future army compositions. Your army will always consist of average infantry that requires some support, some buffs to be effective, average missiles that also require some buffs and some support, great cavalry, some of the best in the game, fantastic flying units, but they do lack strong anti-large infantry and lacks single entities. So basically you will always be lacking one infantry that can withstand a powerful elite cavalry unit, for instance, and some single entities to fight off against other single entities. The most part you'll use your lords or heroes for it. So in terms of special abilities, one of them is the Blessing of the Lady. Now, many lords have this one. You can also obtain this when you fight and you win some heroic victories, I believe, in the campaign map, which you get the Blessing of the Lady for your army, 20% physical resistance when the leadership is higher than broken. So of course, just ensure that you don't have your men routing. And yeah, that's a good, really nice buff. Be on the lookout for when you have your army with this buff. And the second sort of special ability of the army, most cavalry units will have the lance formation. So this is a formation that you can, of course, put them like this in a wedge. They'll gain more mass, more acceleration, more charge bonus, more charge speed, and reduced melee defense. So the idea is that you'll use this for the initial engagement to get the most damage possible in that charge, and thus defeating, of course, your foes with the Thunder's charge. It's a really great ability, and especially one that only Bretonnia has. Make sure you used it. Another notion that you should have with the Bretonnian armies is that they gain a lot of bonuses to their armies with the research. So for instance, weapon strength +10 when fighting against greenskins overall. So melee attack when fighting against Norca, melee defense as well. You also have leadership and missile resistance when fighting against wood elves. So these all count. So the stats that you're are about to see, remember that they also are altered with the research in accordance to which enemy you're facing as well. We start things off with King Leon Kerr himself. Tons of armor with a good bronze shield there to deflect enemy missile fire. He also has great melee attack and melee defense values. Tons of weapon strength, although not a lot of armor piercing really, and a hefty charge bonus. So overall, he's best known actually as a massive tank due to his abilities, we'll see next, and he does survive great odds. He's a really good, one of the most powerful melee lords in the game. So in terms of his abilities, he has the Lion's Shield, giving him 40% missile and spell resistance, really nice buff. He also has the Blessing of the Lady, as you've seen already. Then he also obtains the Lady's Champion. Where is it? There we go. A passive ability that allows him to regenerate. This is what makes him so tanky and such a problem to anyone else. Now, you also gained the Beloved Son of Bretonnia, which is an area buff to your units, gives weapon damage, charge bonus, melee attack, and immunity to psychology to everyone in range if their hit points are less than 50%. And then he also gets the what is it called? The Sword of Couronne, which is a hex, basically a debuff to enemies in range of -24 melee defense and armor by 30. Like I said, he's a menace in close combat. Alberic de Bordelot, he's a very good melee lord. He has good armor and also a bronze shield as well. He has decent melee attack, a rather poor melee defense compared to others, average, let's say. His main notion is that he's doing bonuses versus large, so he has an anti-large bonus. He's great to defeat other single entities or lords or mounts. That's his main idea compared to Leon Kerr. So for his abilities in campaign, he has Spirit of the Tempest, increasing speed and charge bonus. It's great to use with your lord in front of your cavalry, or together with the cavalry, of course. He also has the Hold the Line ability, which typically you don't get. So more melee defense and leadership with in range. What you do get with the Redline skill is actually the Stand Your Ground, typically, so he gets both of these. And in addition, he also gets the Blessing of the Lady, of course, which is, quite the same as others, Once he gets this as well. Oh, he also gets, in terms of once he gets the quests, that's what I was after, the word I was after. So he gets the Trident of Manan with the Raft of Manan. This is a wind spell, 2 charges, really good. Armor piercing magic damage, but the best effect is actually that the Scourge, minus 16 leadership, is a lot. Just by that, it's really cool. Try to get a lot of units with it so that it's really effective. And in addition, he also gets the Braid of Bordelot. Affects allies in range with the bonuses versus lodge and a leadership effect. So altogether, really good against those massive, large armies or enemy armies. He's really good against those. The Fey Enchantress is a great spellcaster with the Lure of Life, but do not assume she's not a melee Lord of Swords. She has rather weak stats with low armor, low melee attack, although with magical damage, and low weapon strength, but has plenty of resistances. Just be careful with any enemy single entities. She can definitely deal with large group of units with her abilities, as we'll see in just a few moments. In terms of the resistance, so missile resistance 15%, spell resistance 25%, and also physical resistance of 20%. That's due to the Blessing of the Lady, of course. So in terms of her abilities in campaign, she has the Favor of the Fae, granting an ally with plus 40 melee attack. She also has the Mist of the Lady. Now this is a damage dealing aura that works while in melee. This is why she's a menace to any low armor or to any infantry blobs that try to surround her. Don't do that. She's really terrifying against those. She also has the Blessing of the Lady. You've seen that. And in addition, she will get as well the Chalice of Potions. There he is. This ability is a bombardment ability, massive damage with a good amount of armor piercing and also magical damage. So on a large strike area, it's really cool. It's kind of like a comet, honestly, and does a ton of damage on that. Typically used in blobs, so again, she's really good against those blobs of enemy units trying to surround her. Don't do that. She's really good against that. And as the last of the legendary lords, you have Réponse de Léonesse, a great melee lord, actually. Decent amount of armor, but no shield. Still good melee attack, but excellent melee defense compared to others. She's the best, actually. She also is really good because she's armor piercing and has his bonuses versus infantry, so a terrible menace against any enemy infantry units. So, as per abilities in campaign, she has the Halo of Maidenly Wrath. It's an explosion that does not affect friendlies, causes magical damage, and blinds the enemies. That's its greatest effect, I would say. The melee defense minus 24, melee attack minus 24, accuracy minus 30. Really good effect on the enemies. You also have the Fleur de Lis banner. So basically a buff of plus 10 to melee defense and plus 8 to melee attack to any allies in range while she is in melee. Really cool, especially put her on the front with your front line or with your cavalry. She'll give up this buff, so basically your armies fight much better. Now, in addition, she also gets the Sword of Léonesse, which gives her a really amazing buff, plus 40 to melee attack and plus 50% to base weapon and armor piercing weapon damage, turning her into a menace really against any enemy lords or heroes or any high quality infantry. Anything she will hit and do a lot of damage. So your basic lord is a melee lord basically with good armor, a shield, decent melee attack, rather average melee defense, and just some weapon strength. Nothing too shabby, just a good amount of weapon damage, not a lot of armor piercing. His main idea would probably be with the charge, put him on a mount, just don't forget to charge him in for the best use of his, of him in battle against any other single entities, for instance. And finally, our last lord choice is the Prophetess, basically a spellcaster, very poor melee stats, low armor, low hit points, low melee attack and low melee defense, almost nothing in terms of weapon strength. Keep her out of any combat, she will basically take a lot of damage with anyone that surrounds her, for instance, even low quality infantry, so keep her on a mount, keep her away from combat. Her main idea is basically just to provide magic for your army, and that's all that she can do. Of course, you do get to have a prophetess of beasts, of lore of heavens, or of lore of life, depending on your choices. So the Prophetess also has the aura of the Lady. This doesn't have a length duration, it's always active. The effect range is 35 meters, so it affects all allies in range. Basically, she'll always give 10% spell resistance to whoever is in range of her. And for your heroes, let's start with the Damsel, your basic spellcaster. You can have her in Lore of Beasts, Heavens, or Life. She's nearly useless in combat, even with a mount. Avoid at all costs combat if possible. Low stats across the board, low armor, low hit points, low melee attack and melee defense. She really shouldn't be on the front line. Most of the time, what you want from her is, of course, the spells. So in terms of the damsels, what they get is actually a spell resistance aura that affects allies in range. Nothing too shabby, just pretty sure it is a good way to have her, a good idea to have her in the middle of some troops, just to ensure that they gain this spell resistance whenever, of course, you're under the effect of some spell. And for your melee hero, a very good melee hero, the Paladin, with the shield, good armor values. Melee attack and melee defense could be higher, but still. And he does have the uniqueness of having a bonuses versus large. So he's good against any heroes or lords in mounts, or any, of course, other single entities. It is always great to have a couple of Paladins in your army, especially because he does have the Guardian ward save, basically. So any unit, or as in any lord or hero, that is in range will get 15% physical resistance. This is always a nice idea to keep a couple of paladins with your lord to protect him or her. So as a special hero unit, you have the Green Knight, a powerful melee hero, a tank, really. He doesn't have any armor because he's ethereal, but he does have a bronze shield, which is interesting. Tons of melee attack, which is also magical and has frostbite because he's ethereal, and a good amount of melee defense. Weapon strength, he is indeed armor piercing fully, which is one of the nice things about ethereal units now. He also has the physical resistance of 60%. This is 40% plus the Blessing of the Lady. And in addition, he gets the Dolorous Blade ability, which gives him more melee attack and armor-piercing weapon damage, so that's effectively plus 50% weapon strength there. And he also gets the Sacred Guardian, so he replenishes. So like I said, a massive tank. Whenever you're able to recruit him in campaign, he'll do his work for you. He'll do the battle for you, really. Just watch out for anything that has magical attacks as well to counter his physical resistance. First off, we have the Peasant Mob. Very low stats, very expendable meat shield. That's all that they're there for, to ensure that your other units don't take up a charge or some missiles to the face. That's their main idea. Go in the front and die so that you can have the time for your cavalry to do the job, or even some of your infantry missile units, etc. So very low melee attack, melee defense, very low weapon strength, not a lot of base armor, base weapon or armor piercing weapon damage as well. Yeah, later on in the game, or even in the basic early to mid game, they won't take up too much of another role. They will get significantly good leadership as well, but still nothing that will make them be even more than just an expendable unit. Man-at-Arms, still an expendable unit, low leadership, low armor, no shield, melee attack and melee defense, and weapon strength also very low. In essence, they're a little bit of an upgrade to the peasants, but not too much. Even in the late game, after all the research, redline skills, and even XP, if you manage to get the XP, they won't get too much better stats, just significantly better in terms of melee attack, melee defense, and leadership perhaps. Overall, you should be upgrading these guys to anything better later on for sure. Spearmen at Arms, a rather more useful unit because they do have that anti-large bonus of 15, which is still decent. Low melee attack but a hefty melee defense compared to others, of course, in the early game. They're still expendable. They do have that charge defensive versus large, so you can use these guys against low cavalry or low quality single entities. Of course, they won't defeat them on their own, but they will do some damage, of course, if the enemy is not careful. Now, in terms of later on, they get a little bit better stats, some decent melee defense and leadership, of course, but nothing to write home about. So definitely you'll have the better version, at least with the shields and with the polearms. You'll see in just a few moments. Now to a little bit of a better frontline unit for the early game, the Men-at-Arms with shields. Now they do have a silver shield, so this blocks significantly the amount of missiles coming in. Note that they don't have as high leadership, they're just getting the ability from the Grail Relic that is next to them, so they have less 12 there for sure. And in addition, slightly better melee attack and especially better melee defense because they do have that shield, so these are a good front line for your early game. As soon as possible to get these guys, certainly supported by the cavalry, of course, which is the mainstay of your army. But yeah, in the late game they do become slightly better, but nothing to write home about. They're more like a tier 2 units in the late game, so the only advantage of over other units would be their price, of course, and their upkeep. And likewise, the Spearmen at Arms with shields, now again with the silver shield, so they're good to withstand any enemies with large amounts of ranged units. They still have that anti-large bonus, such as the regular Spearmen at Arms. Definitely a better choice for you to fight against cavalry, light cavalry, medium cavalry perhaps, especially if you gang 2 units of these guys against them, for instance. Don't expect them to survive too long, of course, against anything really that can destroy infantry, but yeah, for the price that you get, they're decent. Now, in the late game, they do get significantly better stats, especially that melee defense going above 50, and definitely with the leadership improvements, but it wouldn't be the best idea for you as a front line. More likely, you're going to use these guys early to maybe mid-game and then upgrade to better units. Now, one of the interesting units in the roster, this is a support infantry, really, by all means. It's the Grail Relic. It has Frenzy, so their stats are slightly better. And it has the ability of the Icon of Devotion, granting allies leadership plus 12 and immune to psychology. So having one, maybe even 2 of these, well, likely you only need 1 of these in your armies to buff up your front line, is really good to ensure that they don't rout as expected, because of course Bretonnia always has that low leadership. So yeah, it's a good addition to ensure that your front line can fight, especially against those chaos, those demons, those vampires who will have a lot of armies that cause terror. And remember, it still has Frenzy, but they shouldn't have too many good stats in order to fight in melee, so be careful with that. They do get some nice increases, especially in armor and leadership, in melee attack and defense in the late game, but that's mostly just to ensure that it survives and it can gift those buffs to other troops. Don't expect it to be any single entity killer or anything like that. Definitely just a support unit. Finally, your first actual unit, the Men-at-Arms with polearms. These are an armor-piercing anti-large unit. They do have a charge defense against large, so definitely these are a better unit to hold the flanks. They'll do some damage against medium cavalry at least, especially if they are bracing. Just ensure that they are bracing to survive that attack. Not a lot of melee attack, but they do have a good amount of melee defense. Of course, those stats get enhanced later on in the with the research, with the Redline skills, as you can see, better leadership, better melee attack, better melee defense, better weapon strength. So they suddenly become a much better viable unit, at least in the mid game, to ensure that you have your flanks covered, or at least, for instance, your missile units covered, to ensure that they can do all their damage while being safeguarded against enemy cavalry or any flankers. Now finally, onto some real units for your front line. First, the Battle Pilgrims. These are a shielded unit, basically with a bronze shield. Good stats overall. You can see that most of them are highlighted there because they do have the Frenzy ability. So if leadership is high, they'll get base weapon damage, armor piercing damage, charge bonus, and melee attack. So overall, decent melee attack, low melee defense actually. For a unit that has a shield, it's kind of interesting that it has that. A good amount of weapon strength, but not a lot of armor piercing damage. And strangely enough, a good amount of charge bonus as well, especially with that frenzy coming on. Now in the late game, they become more of a, a frontline unit, a tier 2 unit, let's say, something to hold, maybe 3 there to ensure that not a lot of missiles get through to other more important units. So yeah, you can definitely have some of these guys in your armies to hold on a charge while your cavalry goes on and tries to flank, or while your missiles are trying to do their damage. The more staple, let's say, of the frontline units for Bretonnia, although of course always weaker than other army rosters, for instance, or in other armies. And now to your first Regiment of Renown unit, the Holy Wardens of La Maison Tal, Battle Pilgrims Regiment of Renown. Now these guys are interesting because they do have flaming attacks and magical attacks, a good amount of melee attack, decent stats altogether. They lack the shield, do note, remember that, because sometimes it's difficult to notice all these small changes. They lack that in order of a better weapon strength, so these guys are damage dealing infantry. They also have the frenzy ability, so of course while the leadership is high, they will have the base weapon damage, armor piercing, charge bonus, melee attack, immune to psychology. Yep, all of that. So definitely a good unit to have behind other battle pilgrims that will soak in the missile damage while these guys advance, and then they'll go to town against any enemy infantry. Now your elite troops, basically the foot squires, they are an armor-piercing anti-infantry unit, rather a damage dealer, you know, good amount of armor-piercing, good amount of bonuses as an infantry. Still very low stats, melee attack very low, melee defense low, low charge bonus too, but try to get that charge bonus at least, it will help a little bit. Is decent armor, lacking the shield, of course, unfortunately, which is a bit of a problem for them. Later on, they can become quite good, especially in the specific lords. Remember that the physical resistance, it's the biggest change to all the infantry units that you've seen here, because you may get the blessings of the lady, plus 30% physical resistance, that helps. But they do get better weapon strength, better melee attack, and better armor, so they'll become a much better target, a better use of a damage dealing unit, not something that can survive for longer periods of time. They're more to cause the damage, so be sure that you get the timing right with these guys. I'll always bring perhaps foot squires with battle pilgrims, so battle pilgrims would soak, will be the defensive infantry, and foot squires will be the offensive infantry, but don't count on them to win all your battles. These are just some units for your front line. And finally, a regiment of renown of the foot squires, the Beast Slayers of Bastogne. They are different in terms of course, better stats altogether, tons of melee defense in that regard, also a charge defense versus large, and of course, an anti-large unit. So these are great to have, of course, in only one of your armies, because they are a regiment of renown, but in one of your armies, good to protect your flanks, or to use against an enemy lord on a mount or something like that, to surround him and give him a lot of damage. So definitely one of the best units in the roster here, even if slightly average for everyone else's standards. Still bring them on, and they'll do the job. They'll do the work that you want them to do, which is go against those large targets. For your first missile unit, the Peasant Bowman. Decent range, particularly for the type of unit that we have, a very basic archer expendable unit. Not a lot of missile strength, especially not at all a lot of armor piercing, not a lot of in terms of any stats whatsoever, so low armor, low leadership, low speed, low everything, low melee attack, low melee defense. Keep them out of harm's way, just really use them for their missile damage. So they do get later on much better at their task. They get a lot of ammunition, a lot of range and missile strength, and definitely better reload time, so they'll do their job much better. Always consider taking a couple of these units, especially against enemy flyers, for instance. Would always do nicely. But yeah, definitely a very cheap unit that you can count on for a long time, especially early to mid game. So in terms of the next variation of the Peasant Bowman, you have the fire arrows. Basically, they trade off some of their missile strength, their armor-piercing missile strength, over into base missile damage, and they still have that flaming missile. That's their main use. Use them against anything with regeneration, for instance, or weaknesses versus fire, which is much better for this type of unit. Of course, you'll also want the next unit to compare them and to ensure that you use them in the late game as well. They do get better buffs, similar to the other ones: more ammunition, more range, more missile strength, and lesser reload time, so by all means they'll always surprise you in getting much better over to the late game. And we still have a third variation of the Peasant Bowman, this time with pox arrows. So they do cause that poison. This is probably the most staple unit that we'll bring because it doesn't have that issue with reduced armor-piercing missile damage. They don't cause as much base missile damage, but still they do have a little bit more armor-piercing. Causing that poison is always good because of the slowness, because of the reduced stats of the enemy. And as you can see, of course, they get the same buffs as other Peasant Bowman: more ammunition, more range, more missile strength, lesser reload time. So yeah, just ensure that you never use these guys in melee. They won't do anything really, so just keep them out of harm's way, use that ammunition, and when it's done, well, you better hope that the battle is won. For your first cavalry unit, the Mounted Yeoman. Very light cavalry unit. Basically, there you do have vanguard deployment. That's their main idea here. So deployment on the flanks or on the rear of the enemy if you can, to disrupt their artillery, missile units, etc. That's the sort of idea. They won't last in prolonged combat against nearly anything really, so be wary of that. Now, they do have a bronze shield, so at least they can survive a little bit against those skirmishes, those same missile units, so they can impact that enemy without having suffered too many losses. That's about it. Now, in the late game, or after every single upgrade, they do get, you know, a little bit more weapon strength, more melee attack and melee defense, more armor, but nothing that would cause them to change too much. Maybe into the sort of shock cavalry idea, because they will be able, of course, to do a little bit more damage on that charge, but still, you have much better options in terms of the Bretonnia cavalry for me to defend these guys. Just use them, they're expendable, and then get into something else. Now, the real first medium to heavy cavalry, the Knights Errant. Basically, they are classed as an anti-infantry, but that's because of their main stats. They do not have an anti-infantry bonus, by the way. They do have tons of armor and a bronze shield, so they won't suffer too much from enemy missiles. And not a lot of melee attack and melee defense, actually compared to the Mounted Yeoman, but of course significantly better weapon strength there and charge bonus. In addition, they do have the lance formation, so be sure to use this, particularly when you know the enemy will fall in the initial charge for sure. By all means, use this. In the late game, you can still field some armies with these. Of course, you have better options, but don't neglect them. They get a lot more melee attack and melee defense and weapon strength, as well as charge bonus. They'll still do a good damage to any enemies, especially on their first charge, which is their main use. Just charge them in, cycle charge them, and they'll do a good job. Now on to a regiment of renown, the Defenders of the Fleur-de-Lis, the Knights Errant. These are Frenzy Knights Errant, a very powerful shock cavalry actually. They do have that Frenzy ability, which is also giving them the immune to psychology here. In addition to advanced stats, of course, you can notice much more melee attack and melee defense values. Weapon strength also increased slightly, but they gained a power up in the shield, so they have a silver shield. A much better frontline, basically, cavalry if you want to use them as such, or a flanking cavalry. They will go down to any enemy and put the hurt on them. So basically a very wonderful addition to your already other Knights Errant units, or some other cavalry units, of course. Don't neglect them. Even in the late game, they will have their place in your armies. The Knights of the Realm, they are an anti-large cavalry. So basically these are the ones that you'll be sending against monsters, against enemy cavalry and such, or even their heroes and lords on mounts. They do have that bonuses versus large and good stats altogether. Better melee attack than melee defense, so they're still classified as a shock cavalry. In essence, they do have a good amount of armor and a bronze shield. They have that lance formation as well. In the later stages of the game, they even reinforce that shock cavalry value, but they also become somewhat of a melee cav, with losing that disadvantage with the melee defense, and they get more better stats altogether, almost reaching 50 there. So yeah, you can definitely use these guys throughout the whole game. They'll deal, especially against those large units and monsters and cavalry. They'll do their work. Just be sure that you have a little bit of support in case they're having any troubles. But yeah, a very decent unit all through the game. Now to a regiment of renown, the Knights of the Realm ROR, the Knights of the Lion-Hearted. Still armored and shielded, anti-large, shock cavalry. Basically they do have the same damage, but it is also magical attacks. So these are the ones that you're sending against those ethereal units, those demons with physical resistance. You can certainly do a lot of damage with these guys, even if they are not large units, because of that magical damage. They do provide encourage as well, and they cause fear, so that means that they are also immune to fear, which is always excellent. Now, in essence, all of these units, it's a good unit to send with other Knights of the Realm as well, to kick their enemy cavalry into oblivion, and then of course to hammer and anvil. A very nice addition, especially to your mid to late game armies. They'll do the work. Pegasus Knights, a flying cavalry and a really nice addition to any Bretonnian roster. Basically, these are armored and shielded as well. They have amazing speed and weapon strength, because they also are only 24 models, do note. But their weapon strength is really cool, with the bonuses versus large, and they also have Vanguard deployment. Their stats are really not that good for prolonged combat, low melee attack and low melee defense by anyone's standards, but they do get much better in the late game. Their weaknesses of the melee attack, melee defense, and even some of their defensive weaknesses get away. They still are really good in terms of speed and charge bonuses, you can see that. So by all means, you can use these guys from well over from the beginning to the end game without any trouble at all. A wonderful addition to your armies. Questing Knights, an armored piercing cavalry, the first of this kind that you'll see here in the roster. Now they do lose that shield, so they are a little bit more vulnerable to missiles, but they're really good against any infantry. These are the ones that you'll send in to take out the enemy's elite infantry or armored infantry for sure. They can still do a lot of damage in the charge, especially with the lance formation, but their main usage is to keep them in a fight. They have high melee attack and melee defense values, so they'll survive for a longer time and do out a lot of damage. Especially in the late game, as you can see here in the stats above, they get absurd melee attack and melee defense values, as well as weapon strength and extra armor and leadership. Everything gets buffed up, so they can do a lot of damage in the charge, and they'll finish off any enemies. More of a fire and forget unit than anything else. Keep them away, of course, against any anti-large targets. And now to a regiment of renown of the Questing Knights, the Companions of Canals. They are anti-large and armor-piercing, making them deadly against enemy cavalry, of course, especially armored cavalry. And they do have some fire resistance and physical resistance, so these are ones of the best cavalry units that you can get. Of course, it's just an RR, but whatever army you field them, feel free to send them against any enemy cavalry or enemy monsters. They'll do the work for you. Moving on to our elite cavalry, we have the Grail Knights. These are really living saints. They are anti-large. They do not have a lot of armor piercing, even though they were buffed recently. They have a bronze shield and magical attacks. Their stats are all about shock cavalry indeed, but they will be able to defend themselves in melee, especially in the later stages of the game, as you can see there as well. Just one note before we go into it, they do have the Blessing of the Lady, so physical resistance plus 20%, and they have perfect vigor, so they will always be able to keep charging no matter what. That's one of their best advantages. Now in the late game they get up to 18% ward save. Don't neglect this. Ward save is so important, protects against anything really, and they become more of a melee cavalry. By all means, charge them in, make effect of that charge bonus of course, but don't feel afraid, especially in the late game, of leaving them in combat, because they'll do their work, especially of course against those large targets. But if you're searching for an elite cavalry to deal with enemy infantry, there we go. Grail Guardians. Armored and shielded, like heavily armored and shielded, 120, that's a lot. With magical attacks, a good amount of weapon strength, not a lot of armor piercing, but note that it's nearly half, so it's really good and effective. They also have perfect vigor and the Blessing of the Lady, so 20% physical resistance. Yes, by all means, send these guys against anything other than, you know, anti-large infantry, and they'll do their work for you. Now, in the end, look at those melee attack and melee defense values. They get absurd. So you'll be able to send these guys and forget about them, and when you go back to them, they killed whatever you told them to. So yeah, lots of speed and a charge bonus means that you can also use them as a cycle charging cavalry by all means, but if later in the game you don't want a micro, don't worry, they'll do the job. The Royal Pegasus Knights are actually an upgrade of those Pegasus Knights, because they are kind of like the Grail Knights but on a Pegasus. They have a good amount of armor with a bronze shield, magical attacks, so they're very good against those ethereals, those with physical resistance, and they have a physical resistance of their own. They still have that Vanguard deployment and perfect vigor, which makes sure that they don't ever lose that speed, ever become fatigued. It's really good. And they still have that bonuses versus large. So by all means, a couple of units of these to deal with any flying enemies or any large entities. They're really good, especially if you charge them in. They'll do a lot of damage, cycle charge them. Yeah. In the late game, they will have some changes, because they become a good unit to fire and forget. They'll have good melee attack and melee defense values and a little bit more armor and leadership. So by all means, you can send them in and they'll do a good job just with the initial charge, and then they can keep there for a long period of time and defeat whatever foe you send them. Yeah, definitely a great addition to any army. But if you still want some more support from the skies, the Royal Hippogriff Knights are your unit. Basically an armor-piercing beast from the skies. They still have quite a lot of speed and charge bonus, so you can cycle charge them into anything really, and they will do a lot of damage. Especially look for those armored targets, maybe those armored elite infantry of the enemy. They can do a lot of damage as well to any monsters infantry, of course, especially if they have a lot of armor. Don't forget that they have a physical resistance because of that Blessing of the Lady. They don't have perfect vigor. Don't let that sword or that lance mistake you. They don't have perfect vigor as the Pegasus, okay? And they do cause terror. So this unit is really good to charge on the back of enemies, just make them rout, and then cycle charge on the back of other enemies to make them rout and cause the mass rout of the enemy army. So yeah, great addition to any army, especially always consider that they are flyers, so they have that mobility and it will help a lot. Now in the late game, they can be used certainly as a fire and forget unit. Basically because they do get a little bit more ward save, more weapon strength, melee attack and melee defense values, to the point that they can withstand the punishment of being in combat and still benefit from that charge bonus and speed. Wonderful addition. Get a couple of them, or even just a full stack of them if you wish, for your armies. In terms of your skirmishing cav, you have the mounted yeoman archers. Now these are very good missile cav. They have vanguard deployment. They do have fire whilst moving, so they'll keep firing, make them retreat into your army. So of course they'll manage to get all the benefits of that vanguard deployment as well, while of course your cavalry gets into position, your stronger units. They don't have a lot of range, but it will increase, and one of the best things about them into the late game, or at least mid to late game, is that they get better ammunition, better range, better missile strength, all things that they actually lack, and specifically the good thing is the speed. So they'll still get much better stats, to the point that you can kind of use these guys up well until the mid game. It's always nice to have some skirmishing cavalry against especially slower foes that you can, keep peppering with those arrows. And on to a regiment of renown, the Wardens and Montfort. They are very fast as well. Vanguard deployment, poison attacks, that's the difference that they have. So these guys are much tougher for the enemy to catch on. A very welcoming addition to your flanks, trying to just harass the enemy while your main forces get into range. Certainly much better stats, of course, across the board. They can survive against other light cavalry, but don't expect them to survive too long. Just keep them out of harm's way and ensure that the enemy keeps being peppered with those poison arrows, and all will be well. A nice addition to your armies for sure. For your first artillery unit, the field trebuchets. Now, don't neglect these guys. They're actually quite better than they seem, especially because they have a lot of range, and the missile strength is actually armor piercing. One thing that is not showing here is that they're quite accurate. It's quite interesting that they're very accurate, so you can definitely have some armies with some field trebuchets instead of other missile units, of course, to ensure that you can pepper the enemies from afar and wreck their main units, the strongest units that they have, so that your overall force has a much easier task later on. Now, not a lot in terms of any stats to defend themselves. Just make sure that they never get attacked. Keep an eye on them, keep an eye on their flanks, on ensuring that they have some support, and they'll do quite significantly a good amount of damage, especially in the late game, as you can see there, because their range becomes 484. That's really good. Especially their missile strength also increases, of course, and their reload time decreases a lot, to the point that it's almost double. So yeah, definitely a good addition to your armies. And lastly, you do have the Blessed Field Trebuchets. The advantage of these ones compared to the normal version is that they have magical ammunition, so they'll do a lot more damage to magical enemies, or to physical resistance enemies, or ethereal units, for instance, which is always good. Demons, ethereal units, they'll be more susceptible to their attacks. They still have that great range, more missile strength, and more armor-piercing missile damage, which is always nice. And as you can see, in the late game, they do become quite a decent unit, especially with that range and that reload time reduction, even more missile weapon damage. So yeah, definitely a couple of these in any army will do the work that you're expecting, and it will be a good addition to your armies for sure. And there we go, all the units before and after Redline, skills, research, and XP. I hope this helps you out in creating your own army compositions and enjoying the game much more with your Bretonnian forces. So I'll see you guys on the next roster. Bye bye.